Thank you, John. Thank you, Plug and Play. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm very passionate about water. I'm going to say without hyperbole that of the 17 UN SDGs, water is the only one that touches all of them. The current path we are on is completely unsustainable. Everything we know, think, and all the technology we use for water, we have to put it away because it's not going to work anymore. If you want to solve CO2, if you want to help women with equality, if you want to clean up poverty, water should be the focus, so let me explain why. Let me go back to an example that's pretty close to home here in California. This follows a trend that we're seeing throughout the world. Who would have thought that 150 years ago, the biggest lake in the United States west of the Mississippi was right here in California called the Tulare Lake. This was 150 years ago, and what happens globally everywhere thereafter is you say, well, we already tapped out the Colorado River. It no longer gets to Mexico. So we're going to start drilling underground. And as you do that, in the middle, there's a rush to drill. Everybody's going to, and you used to drill down 300 feet for water in California. Now the farmers are drilling commonly 1,800 feet. And the water levels of these aquifers go down. This is what I would call borrowed water, borrowed time. It's an illusion. And what happens specifically in California and in Indonesia, where they're having to move the capital of Jakarta, 17 other major areas of the world, the land is sinking, and it's even contributing to what they call human-made earthquakes. This is happening again throughout the world. All that red and orange that you see there is areas of high water stress where the rivers, lakes, and now the aquifers are getting tapped out. Back when I was young, 10% of water came from wells, aquifers underground. Now it's up to a little over a third of our freshwater supply. Most of those, 2/3 of those aquifers are depleting at an unsustainable rate. And predictably, the aquifers that are declining the fastest are the ones that are under the biggest GDP and agribusiness areas of the world. So water doesn't seem like a global problem. It is a global problem if you conclude rightly that exporting grains and food is exporting water. So you look at the Midwest there, supports 1/6 of the world's grain. It's on top of the Ogallala, which is declining about a foot every year. You look at California, most prolific farms in the world, also declining about a foot a year. Benjamin Franklin saw this way ahead of his time. When the well runs out, we'll know the worth of water. So I want to do a parallel. I grew up in the electricity energy sector, the clean tech revolution, and there's a lot of parallels between what has to happen in agribusiness, water, and everything. We used to have this mantra of lowest cost wins, and that means economies of scale, and that means a big old nuclear or coal-fired plant, and then the bigger the better. Cheaper, 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 and then you distribute it through transmission lines, and then you get it to the retail consumer. Same with water. You have a big old lake or river, whatever, you build aqueducts and then pipes, and you pump it up and over the mountains, and you get it there. There's some real problems with that. First of all, in water, unlike energy, you've got a lot of still coal in the world. You don't have these lakes, rivers, aquifers near demand centers anymore. That water consumes a tremendous amount of energy. About 70% of the cash cost of water is in energy to transport it or to shove it through a desalination membrane. The last problem with water is what we do with it. And this is where it really gets almost scary, because all of our sewage plants in the United States were only treated to get it to a base level of contamination that we could put it back in the river, and then it goes to the ocean. And meanwhile, we're discovering thousands of new chemicals every year that the sewage plants were never made for. And some of them have forever lives, they're called. They are in your water now, PFAS. Measured in parts per trillion, highly carcinogenic, being discovered, being called the new asbestos of water. What do we do about this? Get away from that central planning, economies of scale business. Think locally. Solar, agribusiness, water, energy, all of them have real strong synergies if you think about reuse, recapture, regeneration, common buzzwords at this conference, but not well known outside of it. And so let me look a little bit more closely at the environmental consequences without scaring you too much. And I wrote a report a while ago that said that water is more contaminous, more dangerous than CO2 or any other toxin by far, kills far more people. 1 out of every 6 people in a hospital bed right now is there because of a water-treated illness. You see healthcare costs rising throughout the world, mainly attributable to water. We used to put this water in rivers, assume that it was just trace toxins, and now we're finding that it goes into the oceans and creates gigantic, in this case, a 5,000 square mile dead zone in the Caribbean where fish, even bacteria, can't even grow. Too much fertilizers from all that Mississippi Valley Delta going down that river. The EPA monitors a very scant few of the ones it considers high enough to worry about. Well, some of the most toxic ones are not measured in parts per thousand or parts per million. They're measured in parts per trillion. So it's not just in Flint. This is a diagram that I won't go into the details with, but those yellow and green says there's one toxic material found in these, and this is not above ground. We have the perception that the bottled water and water underground is really clean. Actually, in China, there's been landfills that have been there for so long, rain dripping through it, seeping through it, that all of the aquifers in China that are relevant are now contaminated beyond potability. And in the US, it's becoming a big problem. A little bit more closer to home, we think of ourselves as environmental leaders, and even closer to home. What do we do about this? We got to go back to nature and consider very natural remedies. EcoVap is a company we invested in 3 years ago. It uses biomimicry, which means we build these big plastic towers out of recycled plastic, get rid of all that plastic, we pour water over the top of them, it expands the surface space to air by millions of times, and it gets rid of toxic, nasty water. So for every barrel of oil you get about 10 barrels of really nasty water that used to be put in the streams. That's gone away with. Now it's shoved down underground and can contaminate the aquifers underground, but is causing earthquakes in at least 11 states. We evaporate water at 60 times the normal rate using practically no energy, and then we are able to gather up the residual slurry and sell it to a recycle facility, which is much easier, can much more easily get the lithium and the other precious materials out of it. Another technology that we're really keen on is called forward osmosis. You've heard of reverse osmosis, that's more common. Reverse osmosis is pushing with a lot of energy water through a membrane. Forward osmosis says, just like a mangrove plant, we're going to use membranes, and if you have one water body on one side and another body on another side, the two will homogenize. So by creating a draw solution over here, you can pull whatever you want, lithium, fresh water, or whatever, onto the other side. And so there's practically no energy use, no environmental contamination. It all goes back. Another technology we love is way out in the rural areas. You can't get any water at all, and this technology allows for solar pumping of very shallow seasonal aquifers or annual aquifers to feed farmland so that you don't have to have rerouting of a Chinese river to create a farm. Let me just end by talking about social challenges a little bit. This centrally planned model was never good, and when the UN says we want everybody connected to water and sewage, that's a bad model if you want it to do all. They can't afford it. So we need a lot of smaller scale solutions. When those women, by the way, carry that water, they are very unlikely to go to school. So at this school that I have in Africa, that is what's shown there, we require all the men, if they're going to go to my school, they got to carry the water, they got to fetch the water. And they're no longer allowed, as in most emerging markets, to decontaminate the water by boiling it, because that leads to huge deforestation in the area. If you want to have a high-tech industry, you have to have lots of water because of the data centers, the smartphone needs for water. So water is absolutely integral to all of this. We have a lot of small-scale solutions that I will be talking about later tonight. And let me just end on one big note. Many rivers go right through countries, and you look at the Nile, there's 14 countries upstream, and then there's Egypt downstream. Many projections say that the Nile will no longer reach Egypt in 15 years. Already China is diverting a lot of these rivers from Southeast Asia and polluting what remains. The wars and conflicts that are being tracked now is going up exponentially as a result of these water wars. So with that, we need, and I invite you all later tonight, Mr. Robert Bergstrom has a great new technology for low energy desalination. It's one of the best ideas I've seen, and I see hundreds of them in the water sector. That's all we do at my fund, Alpheus. We need to look at, can this be done? You look at Israel, 55% of the water it gets now is from desalination, but even more impressive, 90% is reused. We don't do any of that in the United States. That's what we have to do going forward. Thank you very much for your attention. The good news is humankind solves problems. We've got a lot of technologies out there. We'll fix this, but it'll take time. Thank you.